Well, I'm gonna get started just so that we can sort of get going. And I'm also gonna share this particular. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Oh, I'm gonna
I usually just
mute yourself. Oh, we have somebody else. We've got Marquita. Okay. So, what I wanted to do was do a couple of things. So talk a little bit about worksheet one. Some folks had some issues with it, didn't do the right scenario, or just, I don't know, had some issues with the level of detail that is required, I think is the other common issue that happened with worksheet one. And so I wanted to do a couple of things. One is for the people that did the wrong scenario, it's really just kind of doing the right scenario, which is it's in, I'm trying to remember what module it is in. Just remind the module. Let's see. If you go to that's where worksheet one is. Okay, so module 4, there's a scenario for program plan and for the project assignment, and then you can just read a little bit. Now, the area that you're going to be most focused on is through the instructions here. This is kind of what the final, when I grade the final project, that's kind of how I do it, so that you know that right off the bat. But what you're going to be doing is you're going to, the premise is that you are a health educator consultant group, you're applying for a grant, and that grant is going to require that you meet 2 goals. And the way you meet the goals will depend on the group. But the 2 goals that everybody has to be able to meet, and so the overarching goals are going to be reduce the proportion of non-institutionalized older adults with disabilities with unmet needs for long-term service and supports. So you're going to be addressing somehow non-institutional older adults with disabilities that have long-term needs, and those needs are unmet. And the other one is to reduce the proportion of unpaid caregivers of older adults who report an unmet need for caregiver support services. And so, so then what do you do with that information? Well, a couple of things that I would suggest doing, and where, you know, in worksheet 1, you had to pick a community that you were going to look at. Have I opened that already? Probably, yeah. So that's going to ask you to see a group of people that can work on it, and it asks you to talk a little bit about the population that you want to work with and describe that population. All of this requires that you do research. Now, my personal preference, and I think one of the things that usually ends up being a little more successful, is before I start assembling a planning team and giving a general description and all that stuff, I start thinking about, well, what is the problem and who should be in the planning team, right? Because I can't assemble a planning team of people that have nothing to do with it, or who are thinking, oh, I don't know why you asked me to be part of this. So the direction I normally go, if I don't know very much about a topic, and some of you might, great, some of you I know may work in healthcare and may be familiar. I know in one class I have a group doing some policy work, and they actually work with this population on issues. So that they have kind of a running start. They're doing great. But one of the things I do is I like to, this is a Google Scholar search, or you can do a search using university databases. But I basically looked for things that dealt with unmet needs of older adults that have disabilities. I ran a search that looked at that kind of stuff. And so I pulled a fairly recent article. This is 2014. There's some older stuff, and then there's some newer stuff, but some of the newer stuff happens to be from other countries, which is not as useful because this is obviously a US issue to address. But one of the things that it does tell you is it places it in context. So it tells you that this problem is increasing, that you're seeing more older adults, first of all, because it's you've probably heard of it as the graying of America. And that there really aren't a lot of things in place, a lot of infrastructure, be it in terms of people or actual services, to take care of those folks. Um, so they look at something called the National Health and Aging Trend Study, which is it's done by CMS, and it looks at Medicare enrollees. So what they do is they do trends and publish those enrollees. I'm sorry, and what they take and what they look at. So what they found is that nearly half of the adults that they looked at, they were having issues with their activities of daily life. So they really were having difficulty, just things like getting dressed, preparing their meals, combing their hair, taking a shower. I mean, those very basic activities were things that had become difficult for them. And when you ask the question in the last month, did you receive help for that? They had not. Okay, so those are very basic. And one of the other things is that a lot of people are working in some kind of, I mean, only 1 in 4 are working in some kind of nursing home or support care setting. So it's not very common, even though a lot of these folks are experiencing this levels of need. So a lot of what the study finds out is that you are going to see that more and more people are relying on their children, their adult children, to be the ones that take care of them, but their adult children are experiencing also some demographic changes from previous populations. Is that nowadays people kind of wait to have children, right? They wait till they're a little older to start having kids. And so they are not in a place in their lives where they can take care of an elderly parent, because they're still taking care of a child. So they're taking they now, this particular article doesn't use the term, but they've been referred to as the sandwich generation. So they're kind of in the middle, taking care of their kids and now taking care of their parents, which puts them at a they are having unmet needs. And so if you look at the two goals that you're being asked to address, that's what you need to be addressing, right? So that's what you need to do. That doesn't mean that to meet those goals, you're going to do the same things, right? So some people may focus on, one of the things we know is that people who live, most older adults right now would rather not go to a nursing home. Okay. They would rather stay at home and age in place. So they would probably prefer to stay in their home. Um, the states have been trying. So if you look at, particularly for poor older people, the states have been trying to get people to stay at home too, because it costs less to pay for home health than it does to pay for a nursing home where people are living around the clock. So so there's this trend to moving people to keeping them in their homes. So what is it, if you're supposed to try to figure out how to meet the unmet needs of people who are not institutionalized, and you are trying to meet the unmet needs of their caregivers, you can think of many different ways in which you could address those needs, right? So from a policy standpoint, you could try to reverse, for example, the need, you could reverse that whole, let's not pay for nursing home care. That could be one thing you could do. And then you could promote among older Americans the fact that they don't need to maybe fear a nursing home. um, or you can say, hey, we're going to go with a trend and we're going to figure out how can we help people age safely in their homes. So however direction you want to go in, that's entirely up to you, right? Now, those the things that you end up deciding you want to do, your logic, so you would have developed a logic model of the problem, that is, again, going to probably differ from group to group. Your goal should be the same, but you most likely, since you're all different people, are probably going to end up with slightly different solutions to the problem. Which, and if you like this article, I can post a link to it. So if you're kind of just starting out, or you're like, oh, maybe there's some interesting data there that I could use. And the other thing I like about these articles is that they give you the terminology to do further searches. So once you sort of learn the language of whoops, I think my chat went on. Yes, I will definitely share this article. Once you learn the language that people who were working in the field use, then you can start doing searches with that language you've learned. And again, you know, I'm not a gerontologist, and I don't know if any of you work in in a nursing home or in those facilities, but they use a slightly different language than the general public about aging. So that's going to be one thing I would do. I would make sure that I do some lit searches. This is one article. You can look at others, but it's good to know what is happening in that population overall. I don't think you're going to find anything really necessarily specific to Mississippi. I've looked because it's of interest to me, and I really haven't found very much. That doesn't mean somebody hasn't done it. It's just has not been published. So um, so that's the first thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is moving on to, let me see if I open, because I sometimes open files over and over again, and I hate doing that. Have I opened two? I don't think I have. Let me just, that's one. Yes, we already did one. Okay, so I'm going to open two. And in some ways, I think one is a little harder than two. I was telling Melinda that. So I think once you've decided, oh gosh, what is wrong with my choosing the right, is it, oh, it's opening it in the wrong, sorry. I've got two screens and it keeps opening it somewhere else and I don't even see it. There we go. Okay, so what we have here is the second model. And so we're looking at the second step of intervention mapping, and I keep referring to in the worksheet to pre-seed, proceed, because I want you to be really familiar with both planning models. And intervention mapping does adapt a lot of the pre-seed, proceed planning framework into its own model. So you are going to, so if you're one of the groups that has to extensively redo worksheet 1, make sure that you do that before you jump into worksheet 2, because it does refer to worksheet 1 step 4 in that first step. So you need to make sure you have that down, and that you've done the research. Don't just, brainstorming is a good start. It's the first thing that you do at each of these steps, but you can't leave it at brainstorming. You need to then go out and do some research and find some specific information. And then you can, if you're looking at things within the community itself, again, that's probably not going to be published. So Google will be your friend, right? Because it's a great way of finding unpublished information, finding out, you know, what are the facilities there? Are there, you know, adult daycares? How dense is the population? So are people living in homes in little towns where people can walk down the block and see somebody else, or are they living in areas where their nearest neighbor is a mile away? You know, those are things that are interesting to know about a population before you go in and start planning anything for them. But once you've done step 1 and you've done all that kind of nitty-gritty research, then you can start working on worksheet 2. And this one, what you're going to do is state behavioral and environmental outcomes. You are going to, when you look at, we start with behavior. When you look at behavioral issues, so let's say that, does anybody want to share one of the things, because I'm kind of trying to make it really general, but does anybody want to share maybe a behavior that they want to change in either their priority population or the caregiver or people around the priority population or caregiver? Does anybody want to change share behavior?
We wanted our caregiver to demonstrate stress management technique, like a relaxation technique.
Okay, so you mean the family caregiver, you wanted them to do
Yeah,
some, okay.
Teach some or have them, learn some relaxation to help deal with their stress level.
Okay.
So in one of our goals, we put that they would demonstrate the ability to do it and the frequency of like relaxation technique.
Okay, well, that's perfect, because that also is going to lead us to a good sort of kind of taking a look at maybe what I mean by brainstorming. Okay, so let's see if it lets me draw. It doesn't always, but it might. Oh, it's letting me. I think it's letting me. Okay, so your focus is going to be caregiver stress, right? And that's in this particular area. And you're looking at caregiver stress. You're going to look at, you can look at it in two ways. One is you're looking at behavior, which is what I asked for. So let's look at behaviors that can increase caregiver stress. So these behaviors are going to be risk factors. It's amazing. Writing with a mouse is the weirdest thing ever. Okay, so you have caregiver stress, and we're going to look at some of the behaviors that are associated with caregiver stress. Can you think of anything?
Ineffective coping, maybe with alcohol or smoking.
Okay. Okay. So yes, we can call that. Yeah, no, it's a. Well, it basically that would basically be infective. Yes, I mean I don't think so. Oh, forget it. Let's call it substance abuse because I cannot write with this thing. But you're right. That would be, it definitely falls under ineffective coping, substance abuse. What about, I mean, some people have been interested in maybe violence. I mean, there are a lot of cases of elder violence nowadays, not just with family caregivers, but also professional caregivers. So abuse or violence, let's call it abuse.
Neglect, abuse, yeah.
Those are also behaviors, right, that we could address.
What about mental health?
Well, I wouldn't say mental health is good, but mental health in itself isn't a behavior, right? But what is it? Not seeking help, right?
Yeah.
So not seeking, so right, so mental health is well, that's the condition you're in, but what can exacerbate it, what behavior can cause this to get worse is not seeking help. And that's really common, particularly if the caregiver is male. I know that sounds like a stereotype, but yeah, that's older males in particular, because, well, they were not raised to seek help. Any others?
What about being socially withdrawn?
Okay. Withdrawing socially, then that makes it a behavior. And again, that is another one. Yeah, isolating oneself, which would have been a shorter word. Withdrawing socially. Okay, so we have good set of behaviors there. See how that's kind of how the brainstorming works. And then in the case of, like, say I wanted to do these behaviors, right? I said, okay, these are all behaviors that I think we need to address. Then I would divvy these up in the group and say, okay, listen, you look to see how common is this, right? How many caregivers are turning to substance abuse? How common is this issue? So then you could do a literature search at that point using the library databases or Google Scholar, and you could find that information. What is this an issue? Because normally if you find an article that is addressing it, they're going to give you the background on the prevalence and things like that. Another one is, how prevalent is abuse and neglect of the elderly? So that could be somebody else who looks at it. Is this a problem we need? Is it, because remember, you're going to be thinking about, are things important and are they changeable? Right? So you're going to be looking for that kind of information. Then somebody else may be going, what about not seeking help? Like not seeking any kind of social support, not seeking, I know in some places there's caregiver support groups. Who's likely to seek them? Who doesn't? Do they exist? You know, and then withdrawing socially. How common is that? Right? So for a lot of these, probably, as I think it was, may have been Lenise that said it, all these are going to point to some kind of mental health issue, and people can become depressed from being caregivers and experiencing that level of stress. So those are the behaviors, right? And that probably falls more into your worksheet 1. But now let's look at worksheet 2. And worksheet 2 is asking us, what are the risk behaviors, right? So these are the things we would list here, right? Those risk behaviors we were talking about, they are the ones we'd be listing. Now, what is really the health promoting behavior? So this is what they're doing, the risky stuff. What is it we want them to do in its place? What would be the mirror image of what they're doing? So if I go into this document and I'm looking at substance abuse, let's say that we decide, yeah, this is one of the things we want to address. What would be the change the font? So what is it, if this is what people are turning to, what is it they could do instead? This is the risk, what is the health promoting behavior?
They would attend a support group, maybe.
Maybe that would be not seeking help. With substance abuse, something you said earlier, Melinda, like maybe stress management techniques, or meditation techniques, or
Gotcha.
mindfulness, right? Something that I'm trying to think, because I mean, there's already stuff that people do. Substance abuse is going to be one of the harder ones to change, right? Because normally there's more to it than just that stressful situation. But and if they're addicted, addictive behaviors they just become hard to treat. But what are some of the things that usually happen? What are some? Does anybody know? I'm not a big person on substance abuse treatment, but what is it that people can do in place of it? I've done some training for people who want to quit smoking, which is in itself substance abuse. So things that we ask people to do, for example, is sort of take deep breaths. That's a stress management technique. So when you feel that, like, you're overwhelmed urge and you feel like you need to smoke, step outside, take a deep breath, right? Because that that's one of the reasons people smoke, is that it slows them down because they're taking deep breaths. So let's call it, they're going to maybe start doing stress management techniques. And let's just call it stress M because it's really hard to write. What about abuse and neglect? And that usually it's because people are having issues with anger, right? Most likely.
Yes.
And sense of feeling out of control is probably what's leading to the anger and neglect. So again, I haven't done a lot with older people. I've done some stuff with abuse and neglect of children. But what would you say is, particularly in abuse, I mean, they're in some ways they're different, but what would you say would be maybe a health promoting behavior? Instead of this, what would we like to see? What is the behavior we would like to see?
I think that would fall under stress management again, wouldn't it? Or maybe anger management techniques. I don't know what
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with children, a lot of times it's just step away. So if you get very, very upset, just instead of staying in it and getting angrier, leave the room and step away and calm down. And then it is basically stress management techniques. So we can, hey, that's good. We can have maybe similar solutions. Oops. Now, what about, ooh, okay, stress man. What about not seeking help?
we put on our we said that the caregivers would be able to that they didn't have knowledge about resources, and that we would,
Okay.
you know, have them be able to at least state at least 2 or 3 resources that they could, you know, seek out.
Okay. So it could be knowledge of existing resources.
Correct.
So we would like them, the behavior we would want them to have is to be able to list those resources, but as well as having them list it, we would like for them to use it, right? So
Correct.
here you might have multiple types of behaviors, because that is, again, all of these things are fairly complex behaviors, so you have a lot of things to work with. And what about withdrawing socially? So socially isolation, which feeds abuse and neglect.
Would this fall under helping them seek out respite care for their loved one that they're taking care of, and so that they could have a break? I don't know.
Well, I think maybe seeking help might be some of the respite care. I think these all things are kind of connected,
Okay.
but again, maybe a social support group, because it's something that they need to do, right? They need to somehow reintegrate themselves. So if they're withdrawing socially, they need to reintegrate socially. So they somehow have to be around others again that aren't the person they're taking care of. So let's say that we want them to attend social support group. So we make it a very clear behavior. Attend social support group. Oh, Lord. Okay. I feel like little kids learning how to write. Attend social support group. There we go. So we have those behaviors. Now, the next thing you do once and again, you would kind of look this up. Like we did this off the top of our heads, but you would look at the people who had done the research on those behaviors, maybe can find ways of what are things that have been done in order to address these problems. And sometimes within these, you can maybe expand it, not necessarily to just caregivers, but if we have people who are withdrawing socially, particularly among the elderly or not seeking help, or who are being abusive and neglectful, even if you don't find it within that age population, you can sort of widen the scope if you can't find anything. The other thing is, if you can't find anything at all, then go back to your health behavior theories, the ones that you did in chapter 2, maybe the ones that you did with Dr. Murphy and the theories class. And so you can generate some reasonable ideas that you can back up with literature, you know. So then the next thing that you're asked to do in this table, well, if I can find it, okay, is to have, what is it, so what are the health probation, so what is it we want to happen, right? So now we have to phrase it as a behavioral outcome. Okay, so as a result of what I'm going to be doing, what is it I want to, so what is it I want to ultimately see? And you can sort of say, okay, so instead of substance abuse, we were saying that they're going to use stress management techniques. Ideally, specifically, and I'm going to do, okay, so let's number these because I'm running out of places. I wonder if it's going to let me lay out different. Yay, it is. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to go to blue. So what is the behavioral outcome I want to see as a result of the program that I'm going to do? So we want them to move away from substance abuse, start using stress management techniques. So if we were to see a healthy person, kind of come up with something specific. So instead of substance abuse, do you want to give a specific stress management technique you'd like to see them do? Because the more observable something is, so let's say that this is what you want to think about. You're running this program and eventually somebody's going to say to you, hey, Lakisa, hey, Marquita, hey, Melinda, did this program work, right? And you want to say, oh, well, yes, I measured it, right? I saw. So how do you measure something? Usually when you're able to see that behavior, correct? Or somebody can say, I did this. So if I'm saying, well, I want them to use stress management techniques, what does that look like?
I can demonstrate the ability to do deep breathing exercises.
Okay, so one of the things you can, so the behavior you want to see is you can say that they are going to have the skill to do deep breathing exercises, right? So that's one way of phrasing it. That they're gonna, why is it? Oh, because it is blue. Have skill or demonstrate skill, right? Probably demonstrates good, but it's kind of long to spell. So they can demonstrate skills of deep breathing exercises. Well, let's look at abuse and neglect, right? So let's say that we're going to do a little training and we're going to talk to people about stress management in order to in order to stop or mitigate abuse and neglect among the elderly. What would be a sign? What would we see in our participants that we would say, hey, we did it? What is it? What would we want them to be able to do when they leave our training sessions and our talks and our intervention? I know you guys know. I know it. I have some creative people in this Zoom session. Marquita, Lakisa.
How would they demonstrate?
Okay, well, let's say that, Marquita, you're teaching. Let's say that you decide that we're going to address elder abuse. And so one of the things we want to do is we want to, and again, this can be done in different ways, but it seems like for this particular one, we are taking people who are caregivers and we're going to teach them how to interact with an older person that, say, maybe has dementia or maybe has they may have a physical, I mean, dementia is physical, but they may have like a physical limitation that keeps them from being mobile and therefore can't do the activity of daily life, the things that they need to be able to do. So we don't want them to get so frustrated and angry that it could lead to abuse or neglect. So you have these sessions. What would you want them to, what would you like to see are the behavioral outcomes of your session? That you would say, hey, these people have the tools they need to maybe help themselves and not get abusive or angry.
Maybe some type of mindfulness exercise. Maybe,
Okay.
Counting to 20 or stepping away from the problem.
Okay.
Going back after you calm down.
Okay. So
yeah, like learning techniques to digress.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's say that then they would be able to demonstrate or list or describe, right? Those are all action. Remember, the more that you can see something, like have is not great, even though that was mine. You want to demonstrate. You want to see something that's measurable. Demonstrate a mindfulness technique. I'm just going to write mind because, well, I can go with fullness. I'm getting good at this. I'm even picking up speed. I hope this is changing my brain, neuroplasticity or something good. Anyway, looking at not seeking help, and we focused on increasing knowledge of resources that exist. So how do we know that they have increased their knowledge? And I think Melinda.
Active in many.
I'm sorry, look, who was it? Lakisa?
Yeah, I said being active in more social groups.
Okay, but what about, because we had talked about increasing knowledge. what would be even easier if we're talking, I mean, I think ideally I would do this. I would say not seeking help. I would like them to increase knowledge about the existing services, right? And I would also want them to start attending them. So I would say that I would have multiple things I want to see on the not seeking help scale. But for knowledge, I may have them list, right? Resources. But if in my red I had put that they would attend, so maybe like we do here, attend social support group, list resources for knowledge, because knowledge is, we just need them to know it, right? And then if we're talking about if we have them attend SSA, we want to see them and you want to be as specific as possible, so attend social support groups weekly. What do you think? And you can always have sign-up sheets, all kinds of things, right? So those could be the behavioral outcomes that we see. So when you want to do eventually is you want to get to, this is what we would want to. Now for all of these things, eventually you have to write objectives that are SMART objectives. So you might as well be as specific as you can in your lists of things, okay? Now, everything that you do, whoops, come on. You want to be able to sort of back up with research as much as possible. So there should be like references to things. Now, for everything that you looked at in the risk behaviors that you looked at behaviors, a lot of these are going to have environmental things that you can do as well, right? So let's say that there is substance abuse is an issue. What can we do in probably the social environment, not so much the physical environment? What can we do to support people that are, you know, we want them to stop using abusing drugs in order to manage their caregiving stress? What kinds of things could we have them do? We'll just do that in green.
Maybe they can join this 12-step program or something like that.
Okay, so the environment would be to make a substance abuse 12-step program available, right? So that's how we change the environment. So I'm gonna number these just because I am running out of space. And 4. So for 1, step program. Okay, now I spoke too soon when I said I was getting better at this. This is terrible. Okay, available. Okay, now let's look at 2. The other thing is we haven't even thought about this, right? So what about, we're saying that they're going to be, we're going to help them deal with abuse and neglect, and we're going to teach them stress management, and they're going to demonstrate mindfulness techniques. Well, what about where are we going to offer this? How are we going to offer this, right? So maybe we need to offer educational sessions, right? Or some kind of resource fair or something, right?
Maybe at a community center.
Okay, so we can do maybe sessions at the community center. That's our environmental, right? That's how we're changing the environment, because we are creating opportunities for people to be able to go these things. And I like that you're using a community center, because that's an existing capacity. Remember, you were asked to do a capacity map for your community. So that's why we do capacity maps, because when we know what kinds of things already exist that maybe we can piggyback on. Okay, and then what about not seeking help and list. So obviously, if we're going to increase knowledge, and we have people list resources, we could do what, like a resource fair, like post them at the community center, maybe. Could talk about a resource fair. What about withdrawing socially? We want them to go to a social support group. How do we get that to happen?
Increase advertisement, like commercials.
Okay, we can definitely advertise it. We need to make sure that they exist, right? That we have a social support group. So if there isn't a social support group, we need to establish the social support group. And then we definitely need to advertise it. What about, we're talking about people who may be the sole caregiver of people with an older person that maybe says had dementia. How are they gonna get out of the house to go to a social support group? Well, maybe
Type
what,
of free transportation organization or something around.
they may need transportation for sure. And what about the person they take care of? Can they leave them alone to go to a social support group?
They can go with them.
Well, but then you would have to have some kind of daycare for adults, right? Because you can't really, have you been with somebody who has dementia? You can't really lug them around too easily. So you might have to offer some type of daycare type for some kind of care for the older person. So notice that you're going to really be changing the environment because you're going to be looking. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do it. Let's say that you do, when you did your capacity assessment, there's already a group that does that. They already do social support groups, or they already do the daycare. Or maybe they do a social support group, but they don't do the daycare. So then people who don't have extended family can help. They can't take their elderly person there. So again, that's why I emphasize doing the needs and capacity assessments so important, because it sort of lets you figure out what it is you need to do yourself. But that's kind of how you go through these different outcomes. This is a list your behavioral outcomes of things that you would like to see. And then for each of the behaviors that you have come up here, you're going to talk about the objectives for those behaviors. So remember I told you you needed to notice that the behaviors are usually like made up of complex parts, right? Behaviors are not that simple. What are the things that people need to do to do that behavior? So if we want somebody to practice mindfulness, there's several things that they need to do. For example, they need to know that they're getting angry. Not everybody knows that they're getting pushed to that point. So they need to recognize what they're feeling at that moment, how they're feeling that they're in fact beginning to lose control, at which step they need to back away. And somebody said, count to 20 maybe. You count to 20, you take a deep breath, right? So there are things that you can teach people those individual behaviors. I'm not saying that you're going to write necessarily a performance objective for each one, but if you're going to be, but if you have different things that you want them to be able to do, you should be able to list what you want, what your objective is for that behavior. And then you do the same thing for the objectives for the environmental outcome. Those do tend to be pretty complex too, because let's say that you want to start a social support group. There are things that you're going to have to do to get to that social support group part, right? So it's not like, well, I'm just going to start one. Well, right. Okay, so you're going to start one. You're going to have to, somebody said you need to advertise for it. You may have to arrange for transportation to it. You may have, there's all these different things that you need to start thinking about that might be dealing with people. Under the pre-seed proceed, a lot of these environmental factors are going to be called enabling factors. So when somebody said, oh, they need to go to the social support group, I said, well, is there even a social support group? Social support group is an enabling factor. The existence of it makes it possible for people to go. So an enabling factor is what absolutely has to be there in order for that behavior to take place. So they are external, right? So my behavior isn't causing the lack of a support group, but I can't go to a support group unless one exists. So usually when you're looking at enabling factors, they may be resources, they may be the accessibility of services, they could be social norms, that it is okay to ask for help. that would be something you'd have to change. So if you are going into a community where people are like, we don't ask for help, that's not what we do here. We're self-reliant. But they're not doing that well because they're really stressing out. Then how do you change that social norm, right? How do you change that way of thinking? And really telling people it's okay is not always enough. You have to kind of figure out why they think that way and how you can address that way of thinking. And then it can also be social support. So actual people there to help each other out. Maybe community members have always been there, but people didn't know it. Now you can connect them with each other. And then you may have to change laws or policies or community priorities or people's commitment to the issue. And then the other thing that's important that is also environmental, usually social environmental, is the reinforcing factor. So if, for example, we have, let's say that the caregivers you decide to target are primarily male caregivers. And we know in the literature, they're the least likely to go to a social support group. What can we do to make it easier for them, right? And so there's things we can do, so if we can get the word out through advertising, maybe through communication campaigns, so that it becomes normal for them to go, right? We can create a situation in which their peers, their friends are going to say, wow, you really should go to the support group. Great, I'm glad you went to the support group. That is positive reinforcement for them going, right? So if you have somebody who was like, I'm not really sure, I don't want people to view me as needy or wimp or, but they go, and then the people around them are like, oh, great, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you've been able to go. I can see you're doing much better and you're feeling a lot happier. Then all of a sudden, maybe people are more likely to go again, right? Because they were told, wow, that's great. So think about it. If you go to the gym and it's miserable, like let's say who like me hates to weight train, right? I hate lifting weights. But if I start doing that and somebody says, wow, you just look so good, and I'm more likely to want to go again, right? Right, because I'm getting positive. People are saying, wow, you're just doing something right. What is it you're doing right? And you're like, I know what I'm doing right. I'm weightlifting, right? You want to do that reinforcement for people. You don't want to have to do it yourself. You want it to be something that if you were to leave, it would continue. So you want somebody in the community. It could, as I said, some of the people I gave you ideas are family, peers, teachers. Obviously, teachers depends on the age of the population. Mm-hmm. Who would you think would be good?
Oh, shit. I don't know what she said. What did she say?
Anybody have any ideas who would be good for reinforcing in this population of caregivers? Nope.
Maybe supervisors.
If they're still working, yes, absolutely. So if you have caregivers that are employed, people who say, hey, you maybe take it as a family leave time or something. Yeah, that's an excellent one. That's also probably even enabling, because yes, having that stress that, maybe giving somebody flex time, because they're taking care of an elderly relative. Excellent. That's a very good one, and that's one that you would have to go through policy most likely. Okay, so for each of the behavioral objectives that you pick, and this is why I'm saying you don't have to pick hundreds of them, right? You just pick 3 or 4, right, that you think are really good, that are really important. Because for each one of these, you're going to do the predisposing factor. So these are kind of the internal things, the knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, the values that we have, our expectations. Those are the things that are going to be the predisposing factor to our behaviors. The reason we act the way we act is usually because we know certain things. That doesn't mean that we know the right thing, but we know some things. We have attitudes that are going to drive the way we behave. There are, we may have beliefs. They may be true, they may be not. We may value certain things over others. We may think we have control. That locus of control is, do we think we can control it? Or do we have an internal locus of control where we think, I'm in control, I can do this, I can fix it? Or do I think outside of me factors, fate, Something else is bad luck, or good luck. Something outside of me is what's causing what's happening to me. That's an external locus of control. And then expectations. Usually it's easier to change people that have an internal locus of control, because you're going to be able to convince them. External is a little harder. And then what are the enabling factors that we need for each of these personal determinants? So what is it that needs to be in place in the environment? Some of this gets a little repetitive. Just go through the process. Give your details. Remember, use the core process, right? For each one of these, you can brainstorm like we did right now. And then once you do your brainstorming to generate answers, then divvy out the stuff you found and have people in your group do the research. It doesn't have to be like a major paper. It's more like bullet points with good references, right? And so once you guys are going to go put it together, then you can make determinations of what needs to be included and what doesn't. And then I just described the core processes there. And then the other thing you're going to do once you've done all of that, all the work you've done to this point, then you can rate your predisposing factors and your personal determinants. You will rate them on importance, and you will rate them on changeability, much like you've already done. You know, that changeable versus important, and find what quadrant they fit in. So you rate them that way. And then once you've rated them that way, you can select from the list which ones are the ones that you are going to target as your behavioral outcome, which ones you are going to target as your environmental outcomes. Again, you do not have to pick everything under the sun. You just need to pick the best things, the things that you think would actually work. And then this is where intervention mapping is a little different from pre-seed proceed, and it has you construct matrices of the change objectives. And so what you do is you put in your performance objective, one for what your behavior is or your environmental objective is, and you are going to state what is it that needs to be in place for that behavior to happen or for that environmental objective to happen. So as I said earlier, sometimes saying going to a social support group isn't sufficient. Or in the case that your book likes to talk about saying, well, let's tell somebody to use a condom when they have sex. Well, that's not sufficient, right? You can walk up to somebody and say, use a condom whenever you have sex. That doesn't mean they're going to do it, right? That you've given them no information. They may not know how to use a condom. They may not know where to get a condom. They may not, So all these things, you need to address all those little parts that are going to allow for somebody to perform a certain behavior. And so you can look at your book for ideas, but make them your own. It doesn't, again, it's pretty flexible. So, and try to do it for like 2 subgroups of your population. Now, you guys are in an ideal place because you're looking at caregivers, and you could be looking at your primary. So you're looking at home caregivers. You could be looking at your priority population. Again, if your priority population is it depends on how you phrased it. But if you pick people with Alzheimer's, you're not going to be doing a lot with them. That is going to help them. I mean, yes, you should try to get them to help themselves, but probably not for this type of program. But you can also look at health caregivers. You can look at communities like this. You can look at the community that they sit in. Is there something the larger community could do to help? You've probably picked some pretty small rural areas overall. So how can you mobilize that community to do something? And then once you've done all of this, then you go to your textbook on page 320 and you create a logic model of change based on all the work you've done to this point. Does it feel like it's something you can do?
It feels like a lot.
I know it is a lot. It is a lot, but listen, really, a lot of it is a lot of words. As I said, some of it is repetitive. What you need to be doing is you need to look at behaviors you want changed. and environment you want changed. And always remember, it's towards those two goals. Now, goals are overarching objectives, so somehow you need to meet those. How you choose to do it might differ. Okay, so those are the little minutia. Does it, you're going to pick the smaller objectives to work on to reach those lofty goals. But I think it's doable. What I wouldn't do is I would not wait till the last minute to do this. And the other thing is, program planning, pre-seed, proceed, intervention mapping, match, patch, all of them, they make it sound like it's a very linear process. It isn't. You might find that as you do worksheet 2, you're like, man, I wish I'd done this on worksheet 1. Well, go ahead, change it. You're still going to be turning in a final project. So you want to turn in the best final project possible. So it doesn't mean that if you did something in worksheet 1 and you're like, you know what, as I go through this, I don't think this is such a great idea. This is a mess. Or you're like, oh, I wish I'd done this. I should have put this in there. Go ahead and change it, right? It sounds like it should be linear. It isn't. You can work backwards. You can work forwards again. And that's why if somebody lost points in worksheet 1 or didn't get points on worksheet 1, whatever they get, it's still fixable. Because this is even the group that did the highest score might decide, you know what, as I go through worksheet 2, I realized I was missing something in worksheet 1. And that's okay. You can add it then. And then if you run into problems, contact me. Any questions? Concerns?
None so far.
Okay. And if you need to schedule a time to meet with me, with a group, let me know. It's going to be kind of crazy, let me tell you. It's going to be kind of nuts for me until probably next Tuesday. And I know everything is due on the 9th. So it's a matter of scheduling time with me. It probably would be in the evening. And then on Mondays, I've got a review session with Epi. On Tuesdays with you guys, but it could be after. So it could be around 9 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock that I could meet with people. So if you need to meet with me, then you need to schedule it with me. Text me or send me an email. Okay?
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, well, I will let you guys go because I know this is long. I think we've gone almost a full hour. And if you think of anything else that you need to remember and you need to talk about, or you remember something you meant to ask, then just send me a text or an email and I'll answer it. And I'll post this video. I'm going to try to break it up into pieces. I think I know how. So you don't have to listen to an entire hour in one go. And the other thing I can do is I'm going to post that article I found initially to show you, so you guys can start off there, maybe look at some of the terminology if you want to expand your search a little bit. So I will let you guys go.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. You too now.
Bye-bye.